So next we're going to look at connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue type. It has 4 classes: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. So let's look at a chart. Here we have the 4 types laid out, and we can see that there's connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. For connective tissue proper, there are 2 subclasses: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, and there's 3 tissues in each of those 2 subclasses. There are 3 types of cartilage and 2 types of bone. We will mainly focus on compact bone, and we'll look at blood, which is an atypical type connective tissue and has a different embryonic cell or stem cell from which the blood cells come from than the rest of the connective tissues. So later when I say all connective tissues come from this cell, it's all but blood. The basic functions for connective tissue are binding and support, protection, insulation, transportation, and storing reserve fuel. Insulation and storing reserve fuel is thanks to fat or adipocytes, which are a type of connective tissue. Binding, support, and protection, those are all going to be common functions for most connective tissues, and the transportation function is mainly due to the fact that blood is a connective tissue. All connective tissues, except for those that are in blood, are going to come from a mesenchymal stem cell. A mesenchymal stem cell is an early stem cell that gives rise to the different types of connective tissue cells that make up connective tissue. All connective tissues have varying degrees of vascularity, so unlike with epithelial tissue, where I could say that all epithelial tissues were avascular, I can't have that all or nothing statement with connective tissue, so we'll talk about each as we go through the classes. All connective tissues, though, even blood in this case, are made up of a living component, cells, and a non-living component, the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is made up of a ground substance and protein fibers. Here's a picture of mesenchymal cells. These are, again, embryonic connective tissue cells, which give rise to all of the connective tissues except for those related to blood. It contains a gel-like ground substance and protein fibers, so it's very similar to the basic makeup of connective tissues. So again, what's in all connective tissues? And in this case, we'll even include blood. It would be cells, which are the living component, a ground substance, which is kind of like a gel-like cytoplasm that's outside of cells, and then fibers. And you have 3 types of protein fibers: collagen, reticular, and elastic. And both the ground substance and the protein fibers are the non-living components of connective tissue. So what if you were asked to list 2 things that all connective tissues are made up of? Well, you'd want to list the cells and the extracellular matrix. Because even though if you asked 3 things, you could list cells, ground substance, and protein fibers, with just 2, you would want to give the general term for ground substance plus fibers, which is extracellular matrix. And it's perfectly fine to define the extracellular matrix as what's outside of the cell, but specifically what's outside of the cell that gives it structure. And you can abbreviate extracellular matrix as ECM. The ground substance, again, is gel-like. It's outside the cell, and it's going to be able to suspend the protein fibers within it. So it is a medium also that nutrients and other substances like ions can dissolve in and diffuse between. It contains things like interstitial fluid, a watery fluid, cell adhesion proteins or molecules like CAMs that we talked about in chapter 3. They allow cells to attach to matrix elements, and then proteoglycans, which trap water in varying amounts, and that affects the viscosity of the ground substance. There are 3 types of protein fibers listed previously, but again they are collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Both collagen and reticular fibers are both collagenous types of protein fibers, but they have different structures. Collagen fibers are unbranched and long, and they're the strongest and most abundant type of protein fiber. They provide a really high tensile strength, and a piece of steel of the same size of a collagen fiber would actually be weaker than the collagen fiber. Collagen is very strong. The elastic fibers are made up of elastic tissue, and they are networks of long, thin elastic fibers that are slightly branched. So they're not unbranched like collagen fibers, they're slightly branched. But the reticular fibers are the shortest and the finest of these protein fibers, and they're highly branched. And they typically surround either blood vessels, or they're going to support tissues that are kind of mushy or soft. So they'll support that soft tissue of organs, creating a stroma. So they have a little bit of give, not as much as elastic fibers, which are going to be able to stretch and recoil. Blast cells versus mature cells. Blast cells you can consider immature cells, and what they're going to do is build or make the matrix. So they're going to secrete ground substance and the extracellular matrix protein fibers. They're the most mitotically active, they're secreting, they're basically making that stuff that's outside a living component or cells. So they're producing the matrix. So examples include fibroblasts for connective tissue proper, chondroblasts for cartilage, and osteoblasts for bone. There's also the hematopoietic stem cell, which is a stem cell that generates all of the blood cells. So it's not necessarily talking about the matrix of blood, but it is a generating cell. And since we've had to kind of take blood out of what we've been looking at, we want to mention its stem cell, which is the hematopoietic stem cell. Mature cells are called cytes. So we would change fibroblast to fibrocyte, or chondroblast to chondrocyte, osteoblast to osteocyte. And then an adipocyte is another example of a mature cell. These are not cells that are mitotically active. They are not producing the matrix. Instead, they're either storing nutrients or trying to maintain the matrix and make sure the health is kept up. Other cells you might find in connective tissues are white blood cells like a neutrophil or an eosinophil or even a lymphocyte. Even macrophages, listed down here separately, are a white blood cell. Then there's mast cells, which are similar to a white blood cell, or the 5 types of white blood cells generally mentioned. They're very close to basophils, a type of white blood cell that release histamine, and histamine increases vascular permeability and causes vasodilation, so that can help initiate the local inflammatory response against foreign microorganisms if detected. The macrophages, again, which are a type of white blood cell, are really large phagocytic cells, hence the name macrophage. They're large phages. So they're going to be able to eat any dead cells or microorganisms, basically function in the immune system as a cleanup crew in order to get rid of any cell debris or bacteria. Here's a basic overview of what a generalized type of connective tissue would look like. You have things like a macrophage, fat cells, capillary, different white blood cells, a mast cell, and the 3 fiber types. We see the unbranched white collagen fibers, the yellow slightly branched elastic fibers, and the reticular fibers, which again are also collagenous but much more branched and make up a network called a stroma for many of the soft organs. So that's in blue. So let's start actually looking at the connective tissues. We'll start with loose connective tissue proper, then move into dense connective tissue proper. With loose connective tissue proper, you're going to see a lot of space in that extracellular matrix. The fibers are not going to be very densely packed together, and we see exactly the opposite in dense connective tissue. Very densely packed protein fibers, not a lot of space in that extracellular matrix, and oftentimes that's going to lead to the fibroblasts or fibrocytes looking really squished together, especially their nuclei. So again, we'll start with loose connective tissue, which will go over areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue, and then finish with dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue contains all 3 tissue types. Adipose tissue is fat cells, so it basically is made up of adipocytes and creates fat tissue, and reticular loose connective tissue is going to contain reticular fibers. So first let's look at areolar connective tissue. This is a type of loose connective tissue, and you can see all the space between the protein fibers, but you should be able to see elastic and collagen fibers in this photomicrograph, and there are reticular fibers there, just not in this view. The location for areolar connective tissue is under epithelial sheets, but also in areas that package or surround organs, and it also surrounds capillaries. The function is really just to wrap or cushion, provide support. It contains things like macrophages that phagocytize bacteria that get past epithelial sheets, and it does play a role in the inflammation response. Its description is really just a good amount of ground substance because it has a gel-like matrix with all 3 fiber types, contains things like macrophages, mast cells, and fibroblasts, and even some other white blood cells. Here we see the adipocytes, so it has a sparse appearance, but it's not actually sparse. It actually consists of closely packed adipocytes or fat cells, and all that white space that kind of looks like a bubble is actually fat, because fat doesn't stain. So that is fat droplets inside the vacuole of adipocytes. You can actually see there's so much fat in some of these cells that they have pushed the nucleus to the side of the cell membrane. This is a type of tissue that functions in reserve food fuel and also insulates against heat loss. It also supports and protects organs. So it makes sense that it's around your kidneys, which are close to the back of your abdominal cavities, around your eyeballs, which are fragile. It's within the abdomen to protect your abdominal organs. It's around the breast to protect mammary glands. And so you're really going to find this type of tissue anywhere that insulation, support, or cushioning is needed, but we can't forget that fat itself is a long-term energy fuel. And last but not least, for the loose connective tissues, there's reticular tissue, which contains reticular fibers. The reticular fibers generate a stroma that supports soft organs, so it forms the soft internal skeleton of organs like those of the lymph nodes, bone marrow, and the spleen. Really just the lymph organs. And a network of reticular fibers is really the biggest description that you can have for reticular connective tissue, but network of reticular fibers in a loose ground substance would be the complete description. And next we're going to be looking at the dense connective tissues: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Dense regular has parallel collagen fibers that are very closely packed together and can be found in tendons, ligaments, and aponeuroses. Aponeuroses are basically flat tendons, and because tendons and ligaments are the locations of dense regular connective tissue, we would find that this type of tissue attaches muscles to bones or muscles to muscles, or even attaches bones to bones, and it can withstand a great tensile or pulling force only if that pulling force is from one direction. If it comes from another direction that is perpendicular to its fibers, it can actually cause tearing of the tendons and ligaments. Whereas dense or regular connective tissue can actually withstand pulling forces from multiple directions because of the irregular arrangement of its collagen fibers. The location for dense or regular tissue is going to be in joint capsules. You can also find a little bit in the dermis of the skin and in the submucosa of the digestive tract. And then elastic connective tissue, make sure when we eventually get to cartilage, you don't confuse this with elastic cartilage, but dense elastic connective tissue is found in major arteries like the aorta. It's also found in parts of the vertebral column, and that's the reason your vertebral column has a good twisting or kind of stretching ability. It's not because of the cartilage that's also found there. And you also find some of this within the walls of the bronchial tube. And it's for this reason that these tissues or areas have elastic tissue, that they're able to stretch and then recoil. The passive stretch and recoil of the lungs for inspiration or breathing in is possible because the lungs contain elastic tissue. So stretch and recoil, major function of this type of tissue. And that's it for our connective tissue proper, so let's move on to cartilage. The three types of cartilage are hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. In general, all cartilages are able to withstand tension and compression. They're avascular and lack nerve fibers, so no blood, no nerves going to this type of tissue. And they receive nutrients similar to epithelial tissue, which is via diffusion from blood vessels in the surrounding connective tissue. The surrounding connective tissue of cartilage is called the perichondrium. It's actually a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds this type of tissue, which again is cartilage. You would find in cartilage chondroblasts and chondrocytes, and they would reside in lacunae, which are these tiny holes or cavities within which the cells have to reside because they can't move around in the thick extracellular matrix. We'll also see that as we age, cartilage can calcify or even ossify, and even before we're born, there's a process that is a natural type of ossification, wherein hyaline cartilage models turn into bone to create the skeleton. So let's just talk briefly about all three types of cartilage. The most abundant type is hyaline cartilage. It appears kind of like stained glass without all the separating pieces, and we can find it at the tips of long bones and then along the axis of the body, in the nose, trachea, and larynx, and the cartilage of the ribs. Elastic cartilage is found in the ears and the epiglottis, And fibrocartilage is found in the intervertebral disc, the knee, specifically the meniscus of the knee, and in the pubic symphysis, which is a part of cartilage or a piece of cartilage that attaches the anterior portions of the coxal bones. Let's look at hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage again contains a lot of collagen fibers. In this view, none of them are being specifically focused on, so we get that stained glass appearance. The locations of hyaline cartilage are in the embryonic skeleton because it's the model for the skeleton. It also covers the end of long bones, so at joints or in joint cavities. It also forms the costal cartilage, which is rib cartilage. It forms the nasal cartilage, which is nose cartilage, and parts of the respiratory tract, specifically the upper respiratory tract, mainly the trachea, also known as the windpipe, and the larynx, also known as the voice box. It has really great compressive stress abilities, meaning it can resist that. It has cushioning properties, and it reinforces anywhere where it's located. Elastic cartilage looks a lot like hyaline cartilage except for the addition of these elastic fibers between the lacunae. The lacunae are the cups that hold the mature cells like chondrocytes, and it's able to maintain its shape even after bending, so it allows for great flexibility wherever it's located. You can find this in the ear and the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a piece of elastic cartilage that covers the top of your voice box or larynx, and it's going to close or cover the opening of the larynx whenever you eat food, so that that food doesn't go down your windpipe, it actually goes to your esophagus. And last but not least, we have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage has a lot of fibers. You can tell in this photomicrograph that it appears the most fibrous compared to the rest of the cartilages, but it still has lacunae, or those cup-like structures that contain the mature cells, the chondrocytes. Locations again are the intervertebral disc, pubic symphysis, and disc of the knee, sometimes called the meniscus. This type of fiber has a lot of tensile strength, but its main claim to fame is its ability to absorb compressive shock. Both the knee and the vertebrae are under a lot of gravitational stress. Next, in our look at connective tissue, we're going to look at bone. Bone is also called osseous tissue. And osseous tissue supports and protects body structures. Think of the rib cage being able to protect things like your lungs and your heart. Inside really long bones, you have a cavity called the medullary cavity, and that stores fat. There's also red marrow areas where blood cells are synthesized. There is going to be a lot more collagen in bone than there was in cartilage. So even more collagenous fibers, but they're going to be ossified or hardened by the addition of inorganic calcium salt, usually calcium phosphates. Then you have osteoblasts that produce the matrix. Those are immature bone cells. And osteocytes maintain the matrix. So immature osteoblasts, osteocytes, mature bone cells. And just like in cartilage, the mature cells are going to reside in cavities, cup-like structures called lacunae. And that's because the hyaline model of bone, so basically the cartilage model of bone before it ossifies, also has lacunae, and that carries over into the actual bone. What we'll see in compact bone is units called osteons. So compact bone is made up of individual structural units called osteons, and bone as a connective tissue is richly vascularized, which is different from cartilage. So cartilage is not vascularized, whereas bone is. So if cartilage turns into bone during a specific ossification process, early on in development before you're born, there must be a process that adds blood vessels to that tissue. So here we can see bone. We're looking at compact bone specifically. And this compact bone is made up of osteons. So here's one osteon. It's made up of multiple concentric circles with a central canal. The concentric circles are called lamellae or lamella. And in between the concentric circles, you find spaces. Those are the lacuna. And in the lacuna would be a osteocyte. The function of bone is to support and protect. It's really going to support and protect by enclosing or forming kind of a barrier. It's able to store calcium, make blood cells, store reserve fuel, and make blood cells is a process called hematopoiesis. It's a very type of tissue because not only is it hard and calcified, but it's well vascularized, so it's able to maintain nutrient components within all of its cells and its parts. So again, main function being support and protect by enclosing. I always think about the rib cage. Also a really good lever for skeletal muscle to act on as far as moving the body. And then last but not least, we'll look at blood. And so blood is an atypical connective tissue because it's a fluid, but it is made up of cells. It's made up of white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells. It also has a large extracellular matrix, which is called plasma or blood plasma. The location is really simple. It's contained within blood vessels, and it is a transport medium. It's able to transport things like carbon dioxide and oxygen, even nutrients and waste products, and plenty of other substances. You don't have to memorize this, so don't worry about this chart being something that you haven't seen before. I just wanted to point out that as opposed, or really remind you, that as opposed to all the other types of connective tissue, blood cells come from the hematopoietic stem cell, not the mesenchymal stem cell. We're going to take a quick look at neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. And those are all of the white blood cells that you could find in your blood. So the most numerous is the neutrophil, and it contains granules, and those granules have an enzymatic defense effect. They're antimicrobial proteins, and because it contains granules, neutrophils are one of 3 granulocytes, which are a type of blood cell that contain granules. All of the granulocytes, so neutrophils, and that's going to include eosinophils and basophils as well, have some phagocytic function. We actually call neutrophils, as kind of like a nickname, the bacteria slayers, because they also have other hydrolases that are able to perform a respiratory burst, and the hydrolases contain a reactive oxidative species, hence the name respiratory burst. Things that you can look at when you're comparing the white blood cells are the shapes of their nucleus and the general size of the cell. And there's about 3 to 6 lobes in the nucleus of a neutrophil, and that's why they're also called polymorphonuclear leukocytes, or PMN, or polys, and they're about twice the size of red blood cells. Eosinophils are probably one of the prettiest white blood cells because of their pink to red staining granules, and they have a bilobe nucleus. They're also about twice the size of a red blood cell. Their bilobe nucleus is going to be 2 lobes that are connected by a piece of nucleoplasm. The eosinophils in function are going to attack parasites, but they also play a role in inflammation, as well as allergies and asthma. The rarest white blood cell is the basophil. It's hard to see its nucleus, but it's usually U or S-shaped with a couple of lobes. And we can't see the nucleus because the granules of this granulocyte contain histamine in a really dark staining as far as the color, and they're going to stain really dark purple. The histamine released from its granules is able to make blood vessels dilate, so we call histamine a vasodilator. And basophils are functionally similar to mast cells, which also were able to release histamine, and both histamine from basophils and mast cells acts very similarly, and we would see increased vascular permeability and vasodilation, which is going to enhance or activate the inflammation response in the body. Then you have 2 cells that are called agranulocytes. So as opposed to the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, agranulocytes do not contain granules. So the second most numerous white blood cell is the lymphocyte, and it contains a really large nucleus compared to its size. It contains a large circular nucleus, and it's so large compared to the size that it almost completely blocks out its cytoplasm. So you'll probably only see a really thin ring of cytoplasm that looks like a crescent moon. You would find lymphocytes mainly in lymphoid tissue, like your lymph nodes and your spleen, very few in your blood. And lymphocytes are, as they are right here, are basically a precursor to T and B cells, which are very crucial to your immune system. Then you have the largest leukocyte, which is another name for white blood cells. And this is the monocyte. Monocytes are really abundant in certain areas, especially sites of injury. They have a dark purple staining nucleus that's U or kidney bean shaped. And they can turn into macrophages, which we have talked about before. So macrophages are voracious phagocytes that eat up debris at sites of injury. And macrophages are found in tissue, where monocytes are found in blood. So there's a process called diapedesis, and that's the process wherein monocytes move through blood vessel walls into tissue. So diapedesis is the movement, and then after monocytes are in tissue, they turn into macrophages, and that's when they become phagocytic. They're really great phagocytes, and then they're usually sent to mop up what's left after neutrophils try to be phagocytes. And that's it for our connective tissue. And for the next video, we're going to go over nervous tissue and then finish up looking at muscle tissue.